Opening the center immediately, this pawn grab asserts immediate influence and prepares for rapid piece development. French defense prepares a pawn chain battle, sacrificing immediate central space for future counterplay. Asserting central dominance, white immediately challenges black's pawn structure and aims for open lines. Challenging the center immediately, this response stakes a claim and opens lines for active piece development. Securing central control with the knight immediately prepares development and can challenge black's pawn structure. Developing the bishop here pressures white's center and prepares to contest the d4 pawn's dominance. Developing the bishop to this square fortifies the d4 pawn and prepares to castle, aiming for king safety and piece harmony. Central pawn tension eases, opening lines and freeing black's game. Reclaiming the pawn with the bishop immediately resolves central tension and prepares for further piece development. Developing the knight to a more active central square, this piece now eyes white's queen and prepares for castling. Reclaiming the diagonal for the bishop now solidifies white's central presence and prepares for further development, aiming to stifle black's queenside ambitions by maintaining pressure on key squares. Challenging the center directly, black seeks to disrupt white's pawn structure and potentially open lines for piece activity. This aggressive posture aims to seize the initiative and prevent white from comfortably developing their forces. A direct assault on black's queenside pawn structure. This advance forces an immediate decision and potentially disrupts black's coordination. Exchanging the bishop for the knight, black liberates the d-pawn and resolves the immediate pressure on the f6 knight, though it does cede the bishop pair and create doubled pawns for white. This choice aims to simplify the position, focusing on active piece play over maintaining pawn structure. Now, black must be mindful of white's potential central pawn advances and seek counterplay on the open files that might arise. The game transitions toward a phase where piece activity and control of key squares will be paramount. Opening the b-file dramatically alters the pawn structure, creating both an immediate open file for the rook and a doubled pawn situation that could become a long-term weakness, but also activating the rook's potential for future play. Seeking to untangle white's pawn structure and develop a queen with immediate influence, this queen's placement eyes central squares and prepares for potential pawn pushes on the queen side. Developing the knight to its natural square, this move seeks to bolster the pawn chain and prepare for kingside castling, while subtly eyeing potential targets on the queen side. Black immediately seizes the initiative, advancing the pawn to confront white's bishop and gain a foothold in the center. This bold thrust aims to disrupt white's development and potentially trap the misplaced bishop, while also restricting white's pawn structure. The tension across the board escalates, creating exciting tactical possibilities. Retrieving the bishop to its initial square after exchanging the light-squared bishops might seem passive, but it prepares for a more robust pawn chain advance by safeguarding the kingside from immediate threats and developing a piece that can participate in central control or support a future kingside attack. A spirited advance, this knight boldly seeks central influence, challenging white's queenside structure and potentially disrupting white's pawn majority on the queenside, all while eyeing the weak c3 pawn and striving to exploit the open c-file for future counterplay. Unlocking central influence and preparing for queenside expansion, this maneuver brings the lady to an active square, eyeing the pawn storm brewing on the queenside while simultaneously bolstering the center's pawn structure. The knight bravely ventures into enemy territory, seeking to disrupt white's centralized pieces and potentially create attacking opportunities on the kingside, while also eyeing the pawn structure. Unlocking the queenside's potential, this pawn advance aims to create a shelter for the king while simultaneously probing black's slightly cramped position, hinting at a future queenside expansion that could overwhelm black's central foothold. Reclaiming the knight's outpost on f6 significantly bolsters black's central presence, aiming to disrupt white's control of the d4 square and potentially prepare for an aggressive pawn push on e5. This repositioning also frees up the g8 square for a potential castling maneuver, enhancing king's safety after an already somewhat congested opening. The knight's new home is far more active, eyeing key squares like d5 and e4 and offering better defensive coverage for the queenside. The queen boldly ventures forward, creating immediate tactical pressure on the kingside and preparing to exploit the slightly awkward placement of black's knight on f6. This aggressive positioning aims to disrupt black's developing harmony and potentially seize the initiative, forcing a defensive reaction rather than allowing black to solidify their central foothold. Securing the king's sanctuary is a prudent reaction to white's aggressive queen advance. Castling now tucks the monarch away behind a protective pawn shield, an essential defensive maneuver given the potential for sudden tactical storms white might try to brew up. Shifting the queen again, white seeks to exploit the potentially cramped queenside of black and perhaps create attacking chances on the kingside. Although this maneuver could also lead to the queen being somewhat exposed if black can coordinate his pieces effectively. A brazen knight sacrifice, aiming to disrupt white's pawn structure and open lines, though it risks leaving black's king exposed. A daring maneuver to reclaim the pawn and activate the rook onto the open file, embracing the material imbalance with a clear plan to disrupt black's queenside ambitions and probe for weaknesses. Liberating the bishop from its pawn chain entanglement by swapping it off on e2 significantly eases black's cramped position, aiming to untangle the queenside pieces and potentially create opportunities on the d-file once the immediate threat on the e2 bishop is resolved. The white king, now exposed, becomes a prime target, forcing an immediate defensive realignment and limiting future attacking options. Black's queenside structure crumbles, leaving pawns isolated and vulnerable to white's advancing pieces. Clearing the third rank with the rook allows for swift reoccupation of the open d-file, a crucial artery for centralized control and future offensive maneuvers. Solidifying the queenside pawn structure now prevents white from leveraging the open b-file, while also preparing to develop the queenside pieces with more breathing room. Steering the monarch toward a safer haven is paramount. The current arrangement of pieces around your king presents a tempting target for black's active pieces, and securing the king now helps prevent immediate tactical threats and offers better defensive flexibility moving forward. A bold thrust to disrupt white's nascent development and expose their compromised kingside. This bishop sacrifice is a tactical gamble, aiming to shatter the pawn structure around the white king and force white to react, potentially revealing weaknesses they'd rather keep hidden. The key is whether the ensuing exchanges will yield sufficient compensation for the material sacrificed, opening lines for your remaining pieces to exploit. A king tucks away, seeking refuge from the immediate storm, but this retreat opens a new dimension of tactical awareness. White's monarch, after its forced detour, finds itself in a less than ideal neighborhood, potentially vulnerable to distant threats and the looming control of open diagonals. Black's bishop now establishes a strong outpost on e2, directly challenging the white king's immediate defensive structure and threatening to unravel white's pawn chain on the queenside. This maneuver simultaneously creates pressure on the central d4 pawn, forcing white to address the growing tactical complexities. Reclaiming the central rank after black's audacious bishop sacrifice, the rook now endeavors to anchor white's kingside defense while simultaneously preparing for potential pawn advances on the queenside. Sacrificing a bishop to disrupt white's pawn structure and open attacking lines around the king presents an intriguing, if slightly audacious, proposition. Transforming the pawn structure with this capture undeniably opens the g-file, presenting a potential avenue for your rook, but it simultaneously creates a doubled, isolated f-pawn, a significant positional weakness that will demand careful management throughout the ensuing middle game. A bold penetration into white's weakened kingside, this knight finds a commanding outpost, eyeing the compromised squares and preparing to participate in the coming assault. Exploring the liberated dark square diagonal, this rook redeployment aims to disrupt black's pawn chain and activate its own offensive potential on the open file. Unleashing a pawn thrust, black aims to disrupt white's centralized pieces and potentially pry open the kingside for future incursions. This pawn advances, a bold declaration challenging white's control of the d5 square and hinting at a positional struggle for dominance in the center. Consider the intricate dance of pieces. This pawn's advance signals a shift in the battlefield's dynamics, forcing white to reevaluate their setup and potential weaknesses. A fascinating development. Black injects new life into the position, questioning the stability of white's pawn structure and opening avenues for more aggressive play. The pawn pushes forward, an attempt to inject some much-needed dynamism into black's position and to create complications for the white king. A bold repositioning, challenging the bishop's current outpost and attempting to pry open the queenside through a potential pawn push. Seeking to untangle the overloaded queenside, black repositions the monarch's defender, acknowledging the pressure on the d-file and simultaneously eyeing potential breaks. A bold repositioning, the queen vacates the potentially vulnerable g5 square, seeking active participation along the third rank and eyeing the d6 square, which is currently weakly defended by black's d5 pawn and protected only by the knight. Black's queen repositions, seeking greater influence over the queenside and potentially eyeing a retreat if the central tension escalates, while also preparing to support a queenside pawn push. Shifting the monarch away from the open c-file, seeking a more secure haven amidst the encroaching enemy pieces, while also indirectly bolstering the pawn structure's integrity. A bold repositioning of the queen, sacrificing tempo for a more active central presence, aiming to disrupt white's nascent queenside pressure. Recapturing the pawn on h4 initiates a renewed offensive push, aiming to exploit the weakened dark squares around black's castled king. A strategic repositioning to bolster the queenside pawn structure and perhaps initiate a rook lift on the c-file, aiming to activate the dormant queen and potentially target white's somewhat exposed king. A daring attempt to seize the initiative on the queenside, aiming to disrupt black's pawn structure and perhaps open a line against the isolated white king. Preparing to contest the open file, the rook boldly ventures onto the sixth rank, setting the stage for a potential queenside pawn push and challenging white's centralized queen. Re-establishing central presence after the exchange of pieces, this redeployment aims to bolster the beleaguered e-file, potentially preparing a later advance or creating defensive options as black's queen arrayed menacingly. Unleashing the rook on the sixth rank injects immediate dynamism into black's position, aiming to exploit white's somewhat awkward pawn structure and the exposed king. This aggressive repositioning creates a direct threat against white's kingside, potentially leading to mating attacks or forcing significant concessions. Unlocking the d5 square's potential now becomes a primary objective for white, as the bishop aims to control it and disrupt black's queenside coordination. Black's queen repositions, seeking to engage the d5 knight's control of the central dark squares, a subtle attempt to dismantle white's entrenched pawn structure before the knights can be effectively coordinated for an attack. Rethinking the aggressive queen sortie, white finally brings a rook into the fray, aiming to contest the now open g-file and potentially build pressure against black's king. Unleashing an aggressive pawn storm on the kingside, this thrust intends to shatter white's defensive cordon and open critical lines against the king, aiming for a swift checkmate by creating attacking threats that white's pieces struggle to adequately cover. The rook's repositioning aims to reinforce the e-file and potentially prepare for an assault on the weakened kingside, a bold attempt to salvage activity from a position where black's central pawns have gained significant space. This maneuver 31, QF5, is a dynamic repositioning, aiming to uncoil the queen from its static defensive post and inject immediate pressure onto white's awkwardly placed king. It challenges the pawn structure on the kingside, potentially opening lines for black's rooks while simultaneously surveying the landscape for tactical opportunities that might arise from white's current awkward formation. The queen's proximity to white's king also forces white to remain vigilant, potentially restricting their counterplay and forcing them into defensive postures. Unlocking the g-file for white's rook, this maneuver seeks to exploit the precariousness of black's king position, potentially initiating a powerful assault. The advanced queen excursion, though seemingly aggressive, opens a critical vulnerability around the black king, especially with the supporting rook now somewhat out of play. Unleashing a surprising threat, This audacious bishop sacrifice on h6 aims to shatter black's king's safety, forcing a sharp tactical sequence that could lead to a decisive advantage if black miscalculates the defense. A daring gambit to complicate the situation, offering the queen to potentially unravel white's awkward king placement and consolidate black's initiative. The rook's advance here, instead of immediate material recovery, bravely ventures into enemy territory, aiming to disrupt black's burgeoning kingside assault and force concessions. Unleashing the passed pawn offers a tantalizing glimpse of queenly promotion, potentially disrupting white's already exposed monarch and central structure. The white queen's repositioning to h5 now presents a direct threat to the black king, forcing a crucial decision regarding its safety. Conceding the rook sacrifice to prevent the advanced passed pawn, black embraces a position where white's king is suddenly exposed in the center, a consequence of the aggressive pawn push. Reclaiming the pawn on g5, white decisively removes a menacing attacker, but the move simultaneously weakens the light squares around his king and opens a path for black's rook to potentially infiltrate on the g-file.